All right, so this is not going to be so much about motivational interviewing because that's literally a 3-day course for most people. But I'm going to go into the essential key elements of any kind of cessation plan, which does involve motivating individuals, among other things. We just simply don't have the time to go into all the detail we would need to on all of this. So I will be talking a bit about that in a few minutes. All right, so to begin with, I want to emphasize that because there are 2 parts to smoking, there are 2 parts to quitting. Smoking is in essence a habit, a behavior, but it's also an addiction to nicotine. So in order to quit successfully, you need to deal with both parts. And I think that over all the years I've been doing this is probably the biggest problem with most people when they quit is they don't realize that. And so they tend to only use a medication, and in most cases, they don't use it correctly, unfortunately. And so that's part of the reason why many people tend to fail. It's important that you all understand that an individual needs to be involved in some kind of behavior modification, whether it's through a formal program that you're doing, individual counseling, or this is, and what I'm going to be talking about today, in essence, is what Linda talked about last week, or 2 weeks ago, is what all the quit lines go through when an individual is quitting. So these are the things that they touch upon. Now, as I said, this is usually when I do this training, it's about 2.5 hours long. So obviously we only have 10 minutes here. So you have my email address there. Please do not hesitate to contact me at any point if you have any questions about any of this, because I'll be happy to go over more things in detail with you. To emphasize the fact that there are these 2 parts, I'm only going to be doing the behavioral part. In 2 weeks, Karen Hudman, who's at Purdue, and Robin Corelli, who's at UCSF, will be going over the medications. They both developed something called RX for Change, which is a curriculum that is been designed initially for pharmacy schools, but now for all types of healthcare providers in how to do all of this counseling and what's involved with it. I put the link to that at the end. If you want to get more knowledge on this, you can take the class yourself. It's actually set up for professors to use with their classes. So there's actually notes, teaching notes underneath each slide. So in essence, you can make this into an individual course by just reading the notes under each slide. And it'll essentially give you the same thing as if taking the class. All right, so that's the first key point. There are 2 parts to smoking, so there are 2 parts to quitting. The second key point here is that smokers had to learn how to smoke. Now, I know that may sound like an odd thing to say, but nobody was born a smoker. So in essence, they had to teach themselves how to do it. So quitting is just the reverse. It's teaching a new behavior, and that is not smoking. So just like learning anything else, you need to have a plan. So that's the second key issue here, is that most smokers kind of just sort of quit willy-nilly, don't really have a plan. They just decide one day to do it. And again, that's why they fail. Think about this. Any one of us could learn how to speak Chinese, but we can't do it by just kind of willing it to happen or not opening the book. I really think that one of the essential parts of any kind of learning experience is to have a good teacher. So again, that's what the quit coaches are and the quit lines. That's what if there is in a group program, the group leader, if they're working with you individually, you're the teacher. So again, emphasize to your, the people that you're working with, that they need to create a plan. Now this plan has 7 key elements, and that's what the bulk of this talk will be about right now. So let's just go through those very quickly. Number 1, you need to pick a quit day, find a motivation, break through the barriers, learn how to cope, use a medication. Again, we'll talk about that in detail, the next one, and then get support. Okay, so we can have the next slide. I'll go through each one of these in detail. Now, I want you to think about quitting just like breaking up with somebody. You can be madly in love with somebody, decide that you hate them, you never want to see them again, but you can't just sort of taper off of them by saying, okay, let's date 5 days this week, 4 days the next week, 3 days the following week, and then we'll break up. We all know, even though it's emotional, that you need to do it on a specific day. So quitting is the same thing. You really do need to have a day where it's just done, over with, and you're finished. Now, that doesn't mean you can't taper to get ready to do that. Many of the medications now are designed so that you can taper. You can be on the medication and still smoke a little bit before you actually quit. So tapering is a good way to get ready to quit. It is not a good way to quit. So my first recommendation would be to encourage the people you're working with to pick a specific day where they get rid of all their cigarettes and end it. Now, given that, there's not one day that's any better than the other. You just have to kind of negotiate that with the individual. So you've got the quit day. Let's go to the next slide. Can we go to the next slide? Can we go to the next slide, please?
Sorry, Frank, it's not advancing. 1 second.
Okay.
Ugh, kicked me off. 1 second.
Frank, it's because you mentioned breaking up with somebody.
All
right, let's see if we can do this now.
Okay, I think there's one more. Go back one more.
There we go. Okay, go back on mute. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. So the second thing you want to look at is helping the person find a reason to quit. So they need a motivation. Now, there are no bad motivations. It just has to be personal for the individual. We generally think of health as the primary motivator, but I can tell you that in most cases with all the people I've worked with, it's one of these other things. It's either the money issue, they don't have it to spend anymore. The average smoker now across the US is probably spending close to $3,000 a year on cigarettes. Our society has changed quite a bit, so it's not accepted in many places. Family pressures come into play, especially like with older people, and their children don't want them to be around the new babies, the new grandchildren. Other issues, I've had a woman in particular quit because it was giving her dog COPD. So I know that may sound silly on the face of it, but she was really serious about it, and that's what I used to help her quit. So help the individual identify a powerful reason to quit. That'll go a long way to making this successful. Number 3 then, even though they may have a very powerful reason to quit, we go to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm skipping one thing here. Okay, so this is where the motivational one, no, that's good. You go to the next slide, that's fine, I'm sorry. So how do we motivate somebody to quit? Well, as I said, motivational interviewing is a 3-day training. And I went to one such training a few years ago, and I asked the presenter, what is the one thing that I can get across to people to make sure they understand this? And his answer was to ask open-ended questions. So you always want to ask questions that begin with what or how. So if you think about this, if you say to somebody, don't you know smoking's bad for you? They're going to say yes. There's no conversation there. But if you say, tell me what the negative effects you think smoking is having on you, they then have to answer in a more lengthy fashion, and they are then, in a sense, forced to have a conversation with you, which then can underscore many of the issues that are involved. Okay, the next slide. So even if somebody has a very powerful motivation to quit, they may have an equally powerful barrier to quitting. These are some of the typical ones, and as we've already learned from several of the people that have been presented, stress is the biggest issue for most people. The key word here, no matter what the barrier is the word only. People think that smoking is the only way they can deal with all of these issues. So if you think smoking is the only way you can deal with stress, you're never going to stop doing it. So our role here is to help them understand that there are other ways, and in fact, that smoking really doesn't do any of these things that are on this slide, but there are other powerful ways to accomplish them. Okay, next slide. Then we want to teach people how to cope. So coping means learning to deal with all those urges, desires, and triggers to smoke without having a cigarette. So again, here is the word only comes into play again. People think the only way their car will start in the morning is if they have a cigarette in their mouth. The only way they can take a break is to smoke. So our role is to teach them that there are millions of other ways that they can do all of these things without smoking. And again, this is very, very powerful because, again, if you think the only way you can deal with stress or the only way you can have a coffee break is by smoking, you're not going to want to quit. So again, quit line, anybody you work with is going to teach a lot of coping techniques. Next. And this is what you're going to be looking at when you're coping. You're either changing what you do or changing how you think. So they're cognitive and behavioral, and then you do them before you get in the situation to eliminate the triggers and the urges, or in the moment to deal with those urges and triggers that come through. Okay, next slide. So if you want to change what you do, these are several suggestions. So you change this avoid situation. So if you're worried about smoking when you go to the bar, just don't go to the bar for the first couple weeks. Change the patterns that trigger your desire for a cigarette. We're all creatures of habit. Deep breathing is a great thing that also can help break a urge right in the moment. Next slide. Changing what you think is also very, very important. And I think the second bullet point is very powerful. Just because you think about something doesn't mean you have to do it. So just because you have the thought about smoking a cigarette doesn't mean you have to have one. This, I think, is probably the most powerful thing we can teach an individual. And again, when we go into the longer trainings, we go into more detail about that. Okay, next slide. These are the cessation medications. There are 7 of them that are approved by the FDA. These are the only ones that the FDA has approved. And again, Karen and Robin will be going over these next time. Next slide. And then finally, the final key issue here is to get support. We know the more support a person has, the more likely they are to quit. So I recommend that people get a support person or a group, somebody at home, someone in their work situation, someone in their social circle. And then don't forget this, there are many people who don't really have much of a social support system. So the quit line counselor or the individual counselor that you might be might be the only person that really cares whether or not this individual is quitting. So you can be a very powerful source of support for this person, especially for individuals who don't have anybody else. Okay, and the final slide. Karen Hudman says this all the time, and I think that this is the key to our talk here today. Smokers don't plan to fail, they fail to plan. So again, that emphasizes the fact that most smokers do not create a plan. So just by you telling them that and just by you helping them create a plan, they'll be much more successful. And then on this final slide is the link to the RX for Change training. It's in, I think, 7 different sections, so you can kind of just tailor it to your needs and tailor it to what you want in terms of the training. And again, so the very, very, very brief overview of all of this. If you have questions, you have my email address. You can feel free to contact me about anything dealing with any kind of behavioral issue with any of your clients. Thank you, and hopefully I got it in 10 minutes.
You were great. You were very close. That was great, Frank. Thank you. I love that. So, a lot of that emphasized and sort of re-highlighted some of the discussion that we've had and things that Frank has offered as suggestions. So before we move on to our case discussion, does anybody have questions or thoughts to add to the presentation about the steps for success?
Well, I'd like to just thank Frank. I enjoyed the breakup analogy, because it is hard to explain to clients why it's so, it can be a bad idea to just continually taper. They get down to 1 or 2 or 3 cigarettes and they just hang tight to those. So it was a good analogy. Thanks.
You're welcome. Yeah, I've actually used that very often with patients. it is primarily, women primarily respond to that metaphor much more than men do. So don't be afraid to try that. Don't be afraid to explain it that way, because it does seem to work with a lot of people.
Yeah, that's great, helpful. Agreed. I'll try that next time as a patient too. I think that it's a good way to sort of talk about, like, it just doesn't really work to taper, in that way. So that's a great analogy.